Welcome back to our study of Matthew. We are now in lesson 10, chapter 15. So, verse 1 says, Then some Pharisees and teachers of the law came to Jesus from Jerusalem to ask him a question. Now, let's look at this. All right. When we left Jesus, he had come from, he was here, right up here in Galilee. You see that? And then, I know it's hard to see it, but this is Galilee. But this is the Sea of Galilee. Now, Jerusalem is down here. They had to walk, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law had to walk from Jerusalem all the way up here to where Jesus was teaching. According to the scale right here, this is 0 to 30 miles, they walked about 60 miles just to see Jesus, just to ask him a question. So what was the question that was so important to them that they had to walk 60 miles to see him? Verse 2, why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? They don't wash their hands before they eat. Oh no. Okay, so it is very important for us to wash our hands. We teach our children, our grandchildren, to wash their hands. Have you washed your hands? We're fixing to eat. We do that for sanitary purposes. But what they were talking about didn't have anything to do with cleanliness, but it had everything to do with ceremonial purity. Now, and they talk here about the tradition of the elders. The rabbis had taught the people that Moses gave an oral law to the elders at Sinai to help the people understand how to follow this law, to just explain it a little better. Anyway, also when the exiles, when they had been exiled to Babylon, there were exiles that came back to Jerusalem. And Ezra, do you remember Ezra in the Bible? There's a book called Ezra. He was a scribe that was sent from the king to Jerusalem to teach the people how to follow the law, because they weren't following it properly, and he was there to guide them, to teach them that this is what God wants. And so that was a really important thing for him to do. He had the Spirit of God in him. He was God-led to do that, to help them. But there were these oral laws that the rabbis and the scribes had, and they changed over the years. Generation after generation were handing down these oral laws that became known as the tradition of the elders. Now they're called the Mishnah. But to the Orthodox Jew of the day, these were just as binding as the written law of God, if not more so. Sometimes they put, it was more, the oral laws were more binding than the law. This is why Jesus said what he did in verse 3. Jesus replied, and why do you break the command of God for the sake of your tradition? For God said, honor your father and mother, and anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death. But you say that if anyone declares that what might have been used to help their father or mother is devoted to God, they are not to honor their father or mother with it. Thus, you nullify the word of God for the sake of your tradition. So let's look at that. Honor your father and mother is the fifth commandment. It is the fifth commandment of the 10 commandments. So this is pretty important, wouldn't you say? This is found in Exodus 20, verse 12. But what would happen at that time, some would say that part of their estate, which could have been shared with their parents who were aging, they didn't have Medicare back then, they didn't have Social Security, they didn't have long-term care insurance, so they depended on their children to take care of them in their old age. And this was what honor your father and mother was all about. But some people were setting aside that part of their estate and devoting it to God by devoting it to the temple. Now, this freed them from any obligation that they had to give that money to their parents to help them. Now, they were still allowed to use that money for themselves, but they couldn't give it to anyone like their parents. Well, what were they doing? Basically, they were wiping out one of the 10 commandments for the sake of their tradition. That's what Jesus was talking about, and he called them what they were. Verse 7, he said, "You hypocrites, you hypocrites. Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules." Now this is found in Isaiah chapter 29, verse 13. And we have to be careful about this too, don't we? Do we ever honor God with our lips? Like when we're singing, are we honoring God, but as we're singing, we're thinking about something else? Are your hearts with that song when you're singing? Are your hearts in worship to God? Or are you just going through the motions? That's what we're talking about here. They worship me in vain. And then their teachings are merely human rules. That's exactly what was happening back then. Human rules. Traditions that they had enforced on the people. And sometimes that happens today too, doesn't it? Traditions become more important than what you read in God's Word. So, Jesus calls the crowd to him and says, listen and understand. What goes into someone's mouth does not defile them. But what comes out of their mouth, that is what defiles them. Okay, let's look at this a little more in detail. Jesus was actually dealing with a deeper question than this tradition question. He was dealing with how the human heart can be made pure and stay pure. Now, what he said here, what goes into someone's mouth does not defile them. He was talking to Jews, including his disciples. This was shocking to them. Jews grew up, from the time they were little bitty, they knew which foods were clean and which foods were not clean. You never put anything unclean, ceremonially unclean, in your mouth. You just didn't do it. And here Jesus is saying, what goes into someone's mouth does not defile them? What? And then he says, what comes out of their mouth is what defiles them. And now they're really thinking, ew, we know what Jesus was talking about. It's our words, right? What we say. Remember, what we say is from the heart. It comes from the heart. But they might not have taken it that way about words. You know, what else comes out of your mouth? Okay, that or that. Not going to say it, but I know what's worse, me acting it out or actually saying it, whatever. You get the gist of what they could have been thinking. But what the deal was, is they had really missed what the purity laws were all about. They were so intent on following the external, making sure that external was correct, that they completely missed the point of the purity laws. God wanted your heart to be pure. Verse 12, then the disciples came to him and asked, do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this? Okay. Why were they so worried about the Pharisees? Well, these are Pharisees, remember, that came from Jerusalem. They were Pharisees and teachers of the law. Possibly and probably they were from the Sanhedrin. A delegation from the Sanhedrin to check this guy out and ask him this question about the tradition of the elders and not washing your hands. So they were very lofty people as far as the disciples were concerned. It was like, oh my, they're from Galilee. They really didn't go to Jerusalem very often, but these guys, they're from Jerusalem. They are, I mean, they were great men in Jewish religion, in the Jewish religious society. So they were a little worried about this, that Jesus had offended these men. Well, was Jesus worried about this? What did he say? He replied, every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be pulled up by the roots. So these men were not planted by God, because these men were not teaching with divine authority. Jesus was. But these men were not. So, they're not from the Father. He didn't even care about them. He said, leave them. Just leave them. They're blind guides. If the blind lead the blind, both are going to fall into the pit. So don't worry about them. Now this blind leading the blind, we need to be careful today about this as well. If the blind leads the blind, the one who follows the blind guide could say, oh, but I didn't know. I didn't know he was the wrong one. I thought he was the right one, so I was following him. Well, Jesus is saying here too that the follower of the blind guide has a responsibility to see that he's blind. Why would you follow someone who's blind? Okay? Make sure that you choose responsibly. Choose your leaders responsibly. Because the end result matters. But you've got a choice, heaven or hell. And you've got to make sure that the leaders you follow are the right ones. I don't know if you're hearing this, but evidently things are going on outside in the hall. So we're just going to ignore them. All right, continuing on. Peter said, explain the parable to us. So the disciples evidently were like, oh, okay, Jesus is not concerned about them. So, but I want to know about this parable. I'm not sure what you're talking about. And here he's talking about what Jesus said about what goes into the mouth does not defile you. And he's thinking it's a parable. It didn't seem like a parable to me, but whatever. Okay. And Jesus, there are several times when Jesus will be asked something by his disciples, and you'll just see him in your mind's eye counting 1, 2, 3. We've all done that with our children because we didn't want to lash out. You count, and then you answer them, or then you take care of whatever it is. Those of you who are teachers, I'm sure you've had days where you've had to count several times in class just to keep from saying or doing the wrong thing. So Jesus said, are you so dull? Jesus asked them, don't you see, verse 17, don't you see that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach and then out of the body? But the things that come out of a person's mouth come from the heart. These defile them. For out of the heart come evil thoughts like murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, slander. These are what defile a person. But eating with unwashed hands does not defile them. And we're talking about the ceremonial purity, but mostly we're talking about the true purity of the heart. Verse 21, leaving that place, Jesus withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon. So let's look at that. Now here, we are you see Galilee up there, the Sea of Galilee up here. Well, here now is the Sea of Galilee, and this is a bigger picture. Right here is Phoenicia. The region of Tyre is here, and then Sidon is way up there at the top. So this is the region of Tyre and Sidon. This is where Jesus is going. Now, I want you to turn with me to Mark chapter 7, verse 31. All right. Now, the reason I want to turn here is Matthew does not tell us where all Jesus went when he went up into the region of Tyre and Sidon. He's going to say that he just immediately went back here. But remember, he doesn't write chronologically always, and he's writing to the Jews. So Mark is writing for a different reason, and he's concerned about geography, and this is where Jesus is taking his disciples at this time. All right, let's read this. Verse 31. Then he returned from the region of Tyre. All right, so Matthew has said that he went up to Tyre, and we're fixing to talk about that. But Mark says he returned from the region of Tyre and went through Sidon. So I don't know if he came back here and then went up here, but so he's in Tyre, then he goes to the region of Sidon, way up there, and then he said he went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee. So he went way up here, and then he's going back down here. Okay, we're going back down this way in the region of the Decapolis. Now, the region of the Decapolis is here on the southeastern part of Sea of Galilee. And it goes out to here, and it goes way down here, okay? But why did he go way up there in order to come way down here? It's a little odd way to go, don't you think? It puts on quite a few more miles, because from here to here it's 20 or 30 miles. Then from this part up to that part where Sidon is, that's 20 or 30 miles. And then to come all the way down here as well, we're walking, we're on foot, you know. That's a long way. It's going to take them a long time to do that. So, why is Jesus making a journey like this? This is a journey. Think about it. Are any Pharisees or Sadducees, teachers of the law, are any of them going to go up here? No. Why? Because this area, all this area is Gentile country. Now right here, we're in Jewish country, but this is all Gentile country. They're not going to go up there if they don't have to. Also, what about the crowds that would follow Jesus? These Jewish crowds. Are you going to have crowds following him into Gentile territory? No, you're not. So, why is Jesus going up there? He's not being followed by people that are taking his time. You know, he was very compassionate. When a crowd came, he took care of them always. But he had to be with his disciples. There were things that his disciples needed to know. And he had to have some peace and quiet. And he had to be in solitude with his disciples for a period of time so he could teach them what they needed to know. His time of departure was rapidly coming. It was looming in the near future. And his disciples were not yet ready. They were not yet prepared to deal with what was going to happen. So he has taken them up here so that he can talk with them in private. Anyway, that's what I got from commentaries, and that's what I've been led to believe. So, continuing on. Let's go back to Tyre, where Jesus meets up with this Canaanite woman. Verse 22. A Canaanite woman from that vicinity, from this vicinity of Tyre, came to him crying out, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is demon-possessed and suffering terribly." Okay, so what did she call Jesus? She said, Lord, and then she called him Son of David. That is not what, that's what a Jew would call Jesus. So what's she trying to do? She wants him to help her. She knows that he's a healer. And she knows that he's a really good healer. And she's tried everything. And she's flattering him. Son of David. She heard, evidently somewhere, that people called him the Son of David. So that's what she did. What did Jesus do? Jesus did not answer a word. He ignored her. Why? Well, flattery was not going to get her anywhere. He wasn't impressed with that. So his disciples came to him and urged him, "Send her away, for she keeps crying out after us. Just heal the child, so that she'll leave us alone." Now, were they compassionate? Probably not. But Jesus answered his disciples, and he said, I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. Now you got to understand this. He was sent to the Jews. He had a promise to fulfill, didn't he? A promise to Abraham to go to the Jews. The Jews had to be told about about the kingdom before the Gentiles. He was sent only to the Jews. So then this woman comes and kneels before him. One other thing I want to tell you about the Phoenicians. This whole area is Phoenicia. In fact, this woman is often called the Syro-Phoenician woman. But the people, Josephus was a historical writer long time ago, and he indicated that the Phoenicians it showed great ill will toward the Jews. The Phoenicians did not like the Jews. The Jews did not like the Gentiles. But the Phoenicians, they did not like each other. So she was trying to overcome her prejudice. People read this and think, Jesus was so prejudiced. Okay, she was prejudiced. There was a lot of prejudice going on back then. She was prejudiced toward him, but she wanted something from him. And Jesus was ignoring her, probably teaching her about her prejudice, trying to get her to lower her guard of this prejudice that she had. He was sort of giving it back to her, okay? Think about other people Jesus had healed. When they were healed, or when he healed someone, like, say the woman who had an issue of blood, he told her, your faith has healed you. This woman was trying to get over her prejudice. And finally, when he said, I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel, she came. She knew she had to do something. He had to help her daughter. Please. She said, Lord, please help me. Help me. And she bowed her head and she knelt. And this kneeling, it's a worship word. She humbled herself to this Jew. And she said, Lord, help me. Well, he looked at her. He replied, it's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Now, the word dogs here, it's not the same kind of dog that like a Jew would call a Gentile. Oh, they're dogs. It's not the same word in the Greek. This word refers to a household pet. You know, your pet that's practically your family. and sometimes, you know, you do sort of accidentally drop something on the floor for your pet because he's like so he was saying it's not right to take bread from the children and give it to the pet. And she said, yes it is. Yes it is, Lord. It is. Even the dogs, even the pets eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table. And she calls him master. And then he could see that she had the faith she needed. She had the faith. And he had the compassion on her. So he said, what did he do? He said, woman, you have great faith. Your request is granted. And immediately, her daughter was healed. Immediately, at that moment. I want to read you a quote I found from I believe it's J.W. McGarvey. Those who have no faith look on him, on Jesus, as beneath themselves. They have no faith. They look on him as beneath themselves. Those who have little faith regard him as only a little their superior. But as faith increases, Jesus goes up and we go down, so that the greatest humility is one evidence of the greatest faith. She humbled herself to someone that she had previously hated. And she put Jesus right up there as the master. She showed great faith. Okay, verse 29. Jesus left there and went along the Sea of Galilee. Okay, he went along the Sea of Galilee by way of Syria and then came down, and this is where he's coming now, right here. Then he went up on a mountainside and he sat down. I'm not going to get into the mountain thing, but mountainside it's a big deal with Jews. Being on the mountain. There's so many things that happened on the mountain with the children of Israel. And he sat down. Remember in one of our previous lessons, when a rabbi sits down, he is officially in rabbi mode. Great crowds came to him, bringing the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others, and laid them at his feet, and he healed them. The people were amazed when they saw the mute speaking, the crippled made well, the lame walking, and the blind seeing. Now this very well could be another prophecy from Isaiah. If you go to Isaiah 35 verses 7 and 8, 35 verses 5 through 6, this is talked about. The lame being cured, the blind seeing, the crippled being made well, the mute being able to talk. So the people were amazed, and what did they say? They praised the God of Israel. This is important because of who they were. This crowd, the crowd of the 4,000, they weren't Jews. They were Gentiles. Because it says they praised the God of Israel. If it had been Jews, it would have said they praised their God. They praised their God, the Jews' God. But here it says these people were praising the God of this land, the God of Israel. So Jesus called his disciples to them. As we're doing this, as we're reading this, I want us to think of the feeding of the 5,000. You remember that? And then we're gonna look at the differences and the similarities between those two: the feeding of the 5,000, the feeding of the 4,000. He said, "I have compassion for these people. They've already been with me 3 days." All right, Jesus had compassion for both, but the 4,000 had been with him 3 days already. Evidently, they had already brought food. Whenever they came to see him, they wanted to stay as long as they could. And they brought enough food to last them for a few days. But now their food is running out, and Jesus has compassion on them. They have nothing to eat now. But now the 5,000, they were only with him for maybe a day, if that long. I do not want to send them away hungry, or they may collapse on the way. And he said that with the 5,000 also. His disciples answered, where could we get enough bread in this remote place to feed such a crowd? Again, Jesus. 1, 2, 3. You know, they've already been through this conversation with the feeding of the 5,000, yes? Because they said the same thing back then. And Jesus, with the 5,000 and the 4,000, says, how many loaves do you have? 7, they replied, and a few small fish. So they had 7. They had some fish, so that was different. So he told the crowd to sit down on the ground. This is different too. And this gives us a time frame of where we are. With the 5,000, he told the people to sit on the grass. So it was sometime in the early spring, because the grass was there. It was green. It was beautiful. That's what it was like in the spring. But here he says, tell them to sit on the ground, on the earth, no grass. So it's thought that they were on this journey for like 4 to 6 months. All right, continuing on. Then he took the 7 loaves and the fish, and when he had given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples, and they in turn to the people. That exact same thing happened with the 5,000. They all ate and were satisfied, 5,000, 4,000. Afterward, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. Now, both had leftovers, but the 5,000 had 12 basketfuls. And actually, the baskets were different. In the Greek, the baskets used to pick up the leftovers were baskets, maybe like this, but baskets where you could carry them. Like if you were going to be going on a day's journey or something like that, and you were bringing your food with you, that kind of basket. So they picked up 12 of those baskets, you know, maybe even about this big, 12 baskets. But the baskets that they picked up, the leftovers in at the 4,000, were bigger baskets. In fact, they were big enough for a man to be in. It's the same word used for the basket that, you remember in Acts when Paul's friends let him down over the wall of Damascus so that he could get away? They let him down in a basket. That's the same word. So it's a bigger basket. So now I'm thinking, okay, well, this 7 baskets it may have been more food than what was picked up after the 5,000. Interesting. It's interesting the things that you find out whenever you're studying these things. Okay, studying the word. The number of those who ate was 4,000 men, besides women and children. Of course, it was 5,000 with the other. Continuing on. After Jesus sent the crowd away, that was different too. Now, with the 5,000, he sent them away. But now here, with the 4,000, he got into the boat and went to the vicinity of Magadan. So what happened with the 5,000? The 5,000, he sent the disciples in the boat, made them go across the lake, while he went up the mountain to pray. But here, he gets into the boat with them, and they go to the vicinity of Magadan. Now, this is Magdala in the background. This is more present day. But I want to show you, okay, this is Magdala, which is in the region of Magadan. So they're here, and now they're coming up here, across the Sea of Galilee, back into Jewish territory. And who is there waiting for him? You get back into Jewish territory, and here we go. Verse 1 of chapter 16. The Pharisees and Sadducees came to Jesus to test him by asking him to show them a sign from heaven. Have we heard this before? If you've been in some other classes, you know that this exact same thing has happened before, but now the Sadducees are involved. And he replied, oh, by the way, a sign, let me read you the definition, is a wonder by which one may recognize a person or confirm who he is. So, you have these Pharisees, you have the Sadducees. The Pharisees were traditionalists. We might call them conservatives. The Sadducees were liberal. So traditionalists, liberal. The Pharisees believed in the oral law. You know, we talked about this oral law, tradition of the elders. The Sadducees did not believe in that. They didn't take that as true. So, what does Jesus say? Verse 2. When evening comes, you say, it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, today it will be stormy, for the sky is red and overcast. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. Now, it doesn't look like a question here. But, you know, these are the leaders of Israel. They, of all people, should have recognized the signs. There were signs, there'd been signs going on for several years now with John the Baptist, now Jesus. So they were blind to the signs of the times, weren't they? They were blind guides. This just confirms miracles will bring confirmation if there is faith. But if there is willful unbelief, they won't know it's a sign. They won't recognize the sign. Again, things are going on in the hall. Sorry. Signs don't convict people of sin or give them a desire for salvation. He continues in verse 4. A wicked and adulterous generation looks for a sign, but none will be given it except the sign of Jonah. Jesus then left them and went away. Now you remember the sign of Jonah. The last time they wanted a sign, this is what he said. None will be given you except the sign of Jonah. That's the 3 days and the 3 nights in the belly of the big fish. And it corresponds to the 3 days and 3 nights of Jesus, the death, burial, and resurrection. All right, so he says, then they went away. Now, when they got across the lake, they were crossing the lake, the disciples forgot to take bread. And Jesus said, okay, now they forgot to take bread. That's kind of a big deal. Why? Well, when they were going across, let's go back to our map. They were going from here over to here. They were going back over to Gentile country. And when a Jew would go, if they had to go to Gentile territory, they would take their own bread. So they didn't have to eat the unclean bread of the Gentiles. So they'd forgotten to bring the bread. Oh no. So in verse 6, Jesus is not thinking about bread. The disciples are thinking about bread, right? What's Jesus thinking about? He's still thinking about this conversation with the Pharisees and Sadducees, isn't he? So, he says, be careful. Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. So, the disciples are discussing it among themselves because they're thinking about bread. Jesus is not thinking about bread. And they said, it's because we didn't bring any bread. Jesus knew what they were thinking. Again, what was he doing? 1, 2, 3. So he says, you of little faith, why are you talking amongst yourselves about having no bread? Do you still not understand? Don't you remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000? We just got finished doing that. And how many basketfuls you gathered? You know, is Jesus really worried about bread? Don't you think I can take care of you? How is it you don't understand that I was not talking to you about bread? But be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. They knew about leaven and that it was often referred to as evil. Evil thoughts, evil whatever, evil teaching. That's what we're talking about. Then they understood that he was not telling them to guard against the yeast used in bread, but against the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. They're not from God. Okay. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, okay, another geography. This is more geography. First of all, this is Caesarea Philippi. Well, it is today. It was much more beautiful back in the day. But this is the ruins of Caesarea Philippi. I thought you might want to see that. But anyway, he is coming. He's gone over across here, and they're going up to the region of Caesarea Philippi. So they're moving on up there, aren't they? Again, no Pharisees and Sadducees are around him. No crowds are around him because he's back in Gentile territory. And he needs to ask them a question. It's time. He's been waiting to ask this question. It's nice. It's quiet. They're all by themselves. They're walking along the Jordan. In fact, I've got some pictures of the Jordan for you. This is actually, there's Mount Hermon. It's very tall. It's always got snow. But when snow melts, it puts water in the Jordan that makes it look very frothy. And then this is a picture my mom took. They are actually walking down a path beside the Jordan. The Jordan is right here. You can't see it, but it's there. And it is along this path that it is thought that they were walking up to the region of Caesarea Philippi beside the Jordan when he asked this question. Who do people say the Son of Man is? And they replied, well, some say John the Baptist. Herod thought it was John the Baptist. Others say Elijah, because, Elijah was going to come. And still others, Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. Jeremiah, because the man of sorrows, or one of the prophets. So the world, the people, were comparing Jesus to other men. But this was not nearly enough to describe Jesus. So he asks his disciples, what do you say I am? Who do you say I am? And Simon Peter, of course, the spokesman, answered, you're the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus replied, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. My mom took a picture of this. This man's name is Joseph Shulum, and he was their guide. but he's also a gospel preacher. He's a Messianic Jew that lives there in Jerusalem. But he was teaching from this passage at that time. Okay, so let's look at this a little more in detail. He's saying, you are Peter, and he called him Petros. Petros. You are Peter. Petros means small rock. By calling him a rock, Jesus was giving him one of the greatest compliments that you could give a Jew. Being a rock was a great thing. But you are a rock, and on this rock, and here he says the word Petra, which means large rock. On this rock, this confession that you have made. So the confession is the rock. What did he say? You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. On this confession, Jesus Christ is the Son of God, I will build my church. Will build my church. This is the first time he's said anything about a church. So, and he says the gates of Hades will not overcome it. So here we have Peter, the small rock, and then we have the confession, which is the large rock, and then we have Jesus, who is the builder. He will build on this confession. And then he gives the keys of the kingdom to Peter, doesn't he? Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. He has the keys to the kingdom. So, what does that mean? It means that he's the gatekeeper. He's the gatekeeper. And this word bind and loose, these words, bind and loose are phrases that the scribes would use when making decisions regarding the law or the Sanhedrin, about the law. Very common words that they would use. So Jesus is using those words about Peter. To bind means to declare something to be forbidden. That's to bind. To loose something is to declare something allowed, something to be allowed. So forbidden is bind, allowed is loose. Now, was Peter ready for this responsibility? Well, not right then. But when the time came, Peter would be filled with the Spirit. The Spirit would be guiding him. He had been chosen, and he would be guiding, the Spirit would be guiding Peter to use those keys. And when did he use them? Well, he used the keys to open the kingdom for the Jews on the day of Pentecost, didn't he? And then he used the keys also when he spoke to Cornelius. And he opened the kingdom for the Gentiles. He continued opening the key for the Gentiles, binding and loosing, because we read in chapter 15 of Acts about this problem that was happening between the Jews and the Gentiles. And Peter had a very key part in that. A key part. Didn't really mean that, but anyway, it happened. So, continuing on, verse 20. Then he ordered his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. Why not? Because they still had not fully grasped what that meant, what being Messiah meant. They still didn't quite understand. So he didn't want them preaching about it. Now in verse 21, now they are walking through this area, Caesarea Philippi, and he's teaching them, his disciples, about the future, what is going to happen, things that they need to know. And he hadn't really spoken this plainly about it before, but he's getting very graphic And they're not taking it well. Verse 21, from that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. This was almost overpowering to the disciples. This was something that shocked them. That this was not in their vision of the Messiah. What are you saying? I don't understand. What are you saying? Now Peter, the spokesperson, in verse 22, took Jesus aside. He took him away from the other disciples. And he began to rebuke Jesus. He said, he was so upset. He said, never, Lord, never, never. This shall never happen to you. It cannot happen. Not like this. And Jesus turned to Peter and he said, get behind me, Satan. Get behind me, Satan. You're a stumbling block to me. You don't have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. This was an important time for Peter and for Jesus. Jesus said to Peter that Peter was a stumbling block to him. And he was such a stumbling block. But the devil was using Peter, someone so close to Jesus, the chosen one that was to be the gatekeeper. He was using him to try and get Jesus to go his direction. Peter loved Jesus so much, just the thought of what he might have to go through, or what he was going to go through. Just, he could not deal with it. But Jesus says, you are a stumbling block to me. Get behind me. You have to listen to me. He told Satan at the temptation, get behind me. Not in front of me. I am Lord. Jesus is Lord. But he needed Peter to understand, Peter, I have to do this. I have to. I have to do it because I love you. I know you love me, but I love you. I love you. And this is why I have to do it. And I have to be the one that does what has to be done. If I don't do this, no one can be in heaven. He doesn't say all this. I'm trying to get you to understand what this was all about. It was a very emotional time. And Jesus had to rebuke Peter very, very strongly to get it through to him that this was not an option. So, then Jesus, they go back to the other disciples, verse 24, and he explains a few things to them. And he's saying, you got to understand this. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross, and follow me and my cross. You are going to have a cross to bear, just like I have a cross to bear. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. And whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Do you remember at the temptation when Satan was tempting Jesus? What Did he say something about the world? I'll give you the world. I'll give you all this. If you'll just follow me, I'll give it all to you. All you have to do is worship me. Follow me. Jesus said, no, I'm not following you. Get behind me. I'm not following you. I'm not forfeiting my soul. What can anyone give in exchange for their soul? They have to understand. And they will. And then he goes on. Verse 27, for the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they have done. You will have your reward. Everyone will. Everyone. I'm dying for everyone. And those that have gone on before, I'm dying for them also. Truly, I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Now, many people think that he came into his kingdom at the ascension. And some people think it was at Pentecost. Whatever it was, the Son of Man came into his kingdom. Now, after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. Okay, you may recall that whenever he goes to Gethsemane, he takes Peter, James, and John also at that time. Both times, he is going on this mountain area to pray. Gethsemane, he went to pray. And in this one, now, Matthew doesn't say he goes to pray there. But if you go to Luke chapter 9, verse 28, it says Jesus went specifically there to pray. And he took Peter, James, and John with him. Now, it said they went up on a high mountain. Let me just... There is a very high mountain that most people think Jesus was talking about, or that was the Mount of Transfiguration. It's right up here. It's Mount Hermon. It's called Mount Hermon. It's right there. Now, some people have thought that it was not in Gentile territory, but I mean, they were in Caesarea Philippi, so it stands to reason that that's probably where it was. Some people thought it was at Mount Tabor down here in Jewish territory. But now most people think it was Mount Hermon because it says a high mountain. And I've got a picture actually of Mount Hermon. You see, I believe at this time it's the summer, but it said that even in the summer there is snow up there. So it's a high mountain. Now, did they climb all the way to the top? Doubtful. But they did climb part way up the mountain at least. All right. There, okay, let's see. Transfiguration. Okay, to Peter, James, and John. Jesus was transfigured first. The first thing they noticed was Jesus being transfigured. And his face shone like the sun, so bright. I mean, evidently it was so bright you couldn't even look at it because it was crazy bright. And his clothes became as white as light. Now, Luke says they became as white as lightning. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Now here, I want to just tell you a few things that Luke said happened that Matthew leaves out. But it said that Moses and Elijah appeared, and Luke said they appeared in glorious splendor. So they were dazzling as well. Maybe not as dazzling as Jesus, but dazzling. Moses, this was Moses, the greatest lawgiver that ever lived, and Elijah, the greatest prophet that ever lived. And they were there. They were talking with Jesus. Peter, James, and John saw it. It was, what? They were speechless. And they were talking, it says. Luke 9 verse 31 says, they spoke about his departure which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. So they were talking about his death on the cross. So it's been, wondered at what they were talking about. Some people think that Jesus just needed the confirmation that this is what needs to be done. Others believe that it is that they are encouraging him. And I believe that they are encouraging him. He already knew what had to be done. But I was talking with Mike Warner, and he gave me some insight on this as well that I want to share with you. He said, there was Moses and Elijah right there with him. And they were great men. They were in glory. They had come in glorious splendor with Jesus. But they were probably giving him great encouragement, because what would happen with them if Jesus did not complete his mission? If he chose not to be sacrificed on the cross, then he wouldn't die. He wouldn't be raised. No, they would not be able to be in heaven. The souls of every person who ever lived, then and in the future, all of our souls were dependent on Jesus. We are with you. We are depending on you. We need you to do this. We need an advocate. We need a priest, a high priest in heaven, to go to God for us, to be our mediator. We need you. And I tend to think that may be what they were doing. Continuing, verse 4, Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it's good for us to be here. If you wish, we'll put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. Really, Peter? Peter was always the excited one, willing to do whatever needed to be done. He was a man of action. And when you are up on when you have a mountaintop experience, you just want to stay there. You don't want to leave. You want it to just stay this way instead of having to go back down the mountain. But he had to go down the mountain, didn't he? And while he was still speaking, a cloud was descending on them. A bright cloud covered them. This was the same cloud that covered Mount Sinai. It was the same cloud that came into the tabernacle. It was the same cloud that came into the temple. It was, I don't know if I'm saying this right, the Shekinah. It may be Shekinah. The glory of God. The cloud where the glory of God was present. And then a voice from the cloud, it was right there, even over the disciples, it surrounded the disciples. This is my son whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. Listen to him. He is my son whom I love. I'm well pleased with him. He's doing what needs to be done. Okay. When the disciples heard this, they fell down to the ground, terrified, absolutely terrified. So remember, I don't know if you remember, but on Mount Sinai, the people were there, and God spoke from the cloud. They were so terrified. They could not go any further. I mean, they were absolutely terrified. It was the same voice. And the disciples were terrified. They were right in the cloud. So it must have been, I can't even imagine what they heard. But this whole thing did give confirmation to the disciples. One, that Moses and Elijah were there with him, and that God himself was saying that Jesus was his son. Jesus is my son. I am pleased with what he's doing. He's telling people the right thing. He has divine authority. Listen to him. Completely gave them confirmation. Now they were able, instead of seeing the shame and the humiliation of the cross, they're seeing the glory and the triumph and the crown. So, they were terrified. We've left them on the ground here. They're terrified. And they stayed on the ground with their face covered until Jesus came up and touched them and said, "Get up. Get up. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. Verse 9, as they were coming down the mountain. No, I didn't do any of those, did I? As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them, "Don't tell anyone what you've seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." They were probably thinking, if I told anybody, nobody would believe me. But there was great danger in proclaiming Jesus as the Messiah without knowing who he was and what he was. And more than anything, this experience that they had made them realize that their conception of the Messiah was way smaller than what it actually was. And they knew they had to listen to Christ, they had to listen to Jesus, because their conception was just out the door. So, the disciples asked him, "Why then do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first?" They'd just seen Elijah. They knew it was Elijah. Don't know how, but probably Jesus told them. But Jesus replied, "To be sure, Elijah comes and will restore all things. But I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but have done to him everything they wished. In the same way, the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands." Then the disciples understood that he was talking to them about John the Baptist. They were shocked at what they saw with Jesus. And now, has our entire conception of Elijah coming, is that not true either? And Jesus is basically telling them, yeah, he has come. They had to learn that the way of Elijah and the way of the Messiah was through suffering and sacrifice, not vengeance and glory. And now the glory is going to come, but not the way they were thinking. They were wondering about this, and they did right about asking this question to Jesus. So they knew now they were going to have to be silent. They had a lot to learn. They had to listen to Jesus like God the Father had said in the cloud. And in Christ's message, we bring Christ's message to the world today. But we aren't able to teach others until we have been taught by Jesus ourselves. And how are we taught about Jesus? How are we taught by Jesus? By reading the very words he spoke in my Bible app. I'm sorry, I don't bring my regular Bible. It's just too big to put up here. But read the words in the Word that Jesus spoke, and you will understand about Jesus and be able to teach about Jesus. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I look forward to seeing you next time with our lesson 11. Bye-bye now.